Maria Ressa. Welcome to Rappler, your social news network. This is Talk Thursday. At least 8 out of 10 Filipinos follow the Corona impeachment trial, with an overwhelming majority watching the sometimes dramatic, sometimes boring proceedings on TV. Survey shows 84% made the impeachment part of their afternoon TV diet. But despite the high percentage following the Corona trial, a small minority, 11%, say they know little about it. Pulse Asia says nearly half of those surveyed, 47%, think Corona is guilty, while a majority of the remaining half of the respondents, 43%, are undecided. 5% of respondents says Corona is innocent of the charges. 69% say the senator judges will be fair and will not favor either side, while only 22% say the senator judges will not be fair and will favor one side. The survey firm says no group influenced its survey, adding that Pulse Asia undertakes these surveys on its own without any party commissioning the research. Defense counsel Ramon Esguerra says, quote, the survey is suspect. He did not elaborate, except to add that he hoped the results were not released to sway the vote of the independent senators. Today we talked to Pulse Asia President Ronald Holmes. Good day, Ronnie. How are you?
Oh, just fine. Good evening.
Good evening. It's good to have you here. Let me ask you about this. The defense is questioning the credibility of the surveys. What do you have to say to some of these charges?
Well, our survey is part of our quarterly surveys. This is the Ulat ng Bayan. What we did was the first quarter survey for 2012. The timing of the survey is something that we've set for about 12 years now. The first quarter survey is normally done February or March, within those 2 months. And the release of the survey results come before the end of the quarter or the first part of the second quarter. In these quarterly surveys, we normally have the same questions that we ask, which rates the administration's performance, but there are also questions that are asked with respect to national issues that are peculiar for that particular quarter. And in the last quarter, of course, we know that the primary issue that has really captured the nation's attention will be the impeachment trial.
Correct. What did you find?
So as you mentioned, what we found is that the amount of knowledge about the issue, when people are asked with regard to their knowledge of the issue, majority would say that they have little. A significant majority would say that they have little or no knowledge at all. The other thing we found out is that about 6 out of 10 would say that their opinion on whether the Chief Justice is innocent or guilty is something that was formed in the course of the trial. And that, I think, is pretty important because the trial is still progressing.
Correct.
In that sense, you can say that their opinion is not something that is fixed. It's something that may be fleeting and may probably change, depending on how the trial progresses, the amount of evidence that is presented, and interaction and the exchange between the defense, the prosecution, and the senators, as well as the news that comes out on television, which they're more attentive to.
This is also before the defense began presenting.
So it was before the defense began their presentation. I guess if you look at the responses, when people say that, when 8 out of 10 say that they were attentive, and of those 80% will say that they get their news from television, this proportion would not necessarily follow the trial. The news that they get will be the news that is reported out at any time of the day from television. And in a sense, what they get there would be summaries of what had proceeded in the trial and statements from any of the players, be it the prosecution, the defense, the president, or the Chief Justice for that matter, prior to and during the period of the conduct of the survey.
And what's the picture? I mean, aside from the stats of that we've talked about, what picture did you get of what Filipinos think about this trial?
Generally, people are attentive to the trial and accusations that have been leveled against the Chief Justice, and you only have about 15% who would say that the Chief Justice is definitely guilty. Of the 47% that media has been reporting out as the proportion of people who found the Chief Justice guilty, only a third of that would really say that he's definitely guilty. And of the 33% would say he's probably guilty. It's maybe you can analogize it with an electoral preference.
Yes.
It's not a solid opinion. And more importantly, as I mentioned, because 6 out of 10 will say that their opinion is formed in the course of the trial, it may swing, no? It may change, it may go towards people saying that he is definitely guilty or people saying that he's probably innocent.
Yes.
Or definitely innocent. It depends really on how the trial progresses. So
the first part of the trial was actually very legalistic. You know, it was a lot of things that people were confused by, the ones who were following closely. I mean, is this an emotional reaction? And some people aren't informed, and yet they'll actually say, I think he's guilty or he's not guilty. How much of it is based on facts?
well, if we base it on the survey results, I don't think that the people really followed the trial
Yes.
as it progressed. What they were really what they might really reach them were the news on television.
So the role of media is actually
So the
critical.
role of media there, and we should not in any way discount that role, because as it has been shown, really it's just a question of what news had been conveyed via television and radio. But definitely, when people were asked, when we asked a question as to whether they think that the Chief Justice is innocent or guilty, there were 6 choices that were given, and one of those choices was that they could not in any way state their position because they're not familiar, they don't have that much knowledge,
Yep.
and yet despite that option, they opted to either say that he's innocent, probably guilty, or not guilty, or definitely guilty.
Yes.
So there was that option given that they don't have any enough basis for making a decision, and yet the public at that time really just took on a judgment which to a great extent will be not necessarily firm, but something that may change depending on the trial.
What's at stake for the Philippines in this impeachment process?
Well, if I go beyond the survey,
Definitely.
what's at stake really is the operationalization of a process that secures horizontal accountability. This is not the first impeachment trial that we've had. The first impeachment trial was actually abbreviated. What would be good if this impeachment trial is completed? Then people would know essentially how a process of impeachment, how easy or how difficult, and what are the things that one has to take into account in impeaching an official. I think we had several questions, for example, whether people thought that the House of Representatives fast-tracked the process,
Correct.
and people were divided about that. At the time that we did the survey, the prosecution had already rested its case.
Yes.
I don't think people really read all the 8 articles of impeachment, but as a political scientist, I was a little bit surprised by the fact that suddenly when they rested the case, they
dropped.
dropped five of the articles.
Correct.
Because, that in itself shows that probably there's confidence on their part, but at the same time, there are 8 articles, and
Yeah.
those 5 other articles, from my perspective, are equally important articles that should be proven
Yeah.
in the impeachment court.
Well, it's also interesting that the people in urban areas seem to think that there were more people in urban areas who thought the prosecution wasn't prepared than in the rural areas.
Not necessarily as significantly high, but what we found interesting was that there was much more attentiveness on the part of people in Mindanao. For what reason, of course, it's not something that we probe into. You have less attentiveness really in the Visayas, but more in Mindanao, outside of NCR. NCR, the National Capital Region, we would think that that is something that can be anticipated. Across the years that we've conducted survey, urban voters or urban citizens generally give much more attention to issues of graft and corruption compared to, let's say, rural Filipinos, who would give more emphasis to, let's say, gut issues like inflation or the reduction of poverty or
Right.
the increase in terms of pay. But you do have a marginally higher attentiveness in the case of Mindanao.
It's funny, actually, what we've found, at least in a lot of cases, Mindanao, because they live in a more insecure environment, are more attentive to a lot of issues of the economy, at least this is in a lot of our stories, empowerment, issues of empowerment, climate change. A question here is, you talked about process and why would be important for the Philippines to go through. This process, though, in what you've seen, you're a political scientist as well, and how is this process helping the maturity of Filipinos, political maturity?
Well, it puts to a test really, or exhibits the institutional process of securing accountability. As you said, for example, in the trial, there were many legal issues that came out at the beginning.
Yes.
Whether certain evidences are admissible, whether certain motions are themselves out of order. And we've heard so many times that this is a sui generis process. It's not necessarily completely legal, it is also political. And to me, that's very important. And I think that's the reason why we included it also in our own survey. It's a political process. Every Filipino is party to it. Of course, the ones who will make decisions are generally the ones that we elected, the senators for that matter.
Right.
But I don't think that it is right or proper for us not to be able to sense where people position themselves with regard to a public process.
So how large a role will public opinion play in this process?
I would say that I would tend to agree with the senators that insofar as the decision would largely be based on what had been presented to them.
Yes.
And I guess one of the things that might be comforting to the Senate is that regardless of their decision, a significant majority would say whether this is aligned or not aligned with their own opinion,
right,
that they would accept it.
Right.
So this to me gives the Senate much more leeway. Actually, the Senate in itself is in full authority to make a decision, and they just have to recognize the opinion. It's not necessarily that the opinion has to matter.
Yes.
Insofar as their decision, because the information that they have is definitely much more.
Right.
And their knowledge and awareness of all of those information is definitely much more than the ordinary Filipino.
But there are many of those senators who will be seeking re-election. Is this a factor in 2013?
There are 6 of them,
yep,
if I'm not mistaken, would be seeking re-election. And those 6, I don't know exactly how much they will pay attention to what the people say, no? And whether their decision in some way would affect their re-election chances. Because there are many other issues that definitely they have to confront, no? When
yes,
they face the voters. And it's not just a question of how they position themselves on the impeachment. Many other issues, their own performance and their position on more substantive issues, equally substantive issues outside of the impeachment.
There are other things that's happening now with this impeachment trial. I mean, some people are saying that it's expecting the pot to call the kettle black. It's forcing definitions in our society. What are your thoughts on this, on issues of SAL-N compliance, on corruption?
Well, since the central issue over the past few weeks has been whether there was an intent insofar as not disclosing in the SAL-N, and in the last few days we've heard the defense saying that there are other officials who've equally been remiss in the submission or in their truthfulness in providing the same information that they allege had not been provided by the Chief Justice.
Right.
I guess to a certain extent it mirrors limitations insofar as laws or the operationalization of laws that are supposed to secure transparency and accountability. The lack of guidelines has been pointed out by some senator judges with regard to what do we put in the SAL-N. There's a new SAL-N guide. There are new guidelines that have been conveyed by the Civil Service Commission. Some senators are saying, do we even put them what we purchased for grocery in the past week? So, but that in itself points out one thing, that the reason why the SAL-N, the net worth, is required is so that we know that our political leaders, both elective and those serving in administration, appointed, do not enrich themselves
Right.
when they're in their position. But we also know, historically, that in our words in political science, there are many rent seekers.
Correct. Or in journalist language, there's endemic corruption.
There's corruption, and in some of the theories, of course, we know that there are predators. So unless you change the system, it's not just a question of submission of SALN.
Right.
There are ways by which you can evade prosecution because of the lack of truthfulness or honesty. So it's really something that's systemic. It's a problem that has to be cured, not simply by focusing on one instrument, which is the statement of assets, liabilities, and net worth, but many other things.
But in this situation, though, will this trial actually define a line for public officials in terms of the SALN itself?
Well, it highlights really the integrity that people will really have to look for with regard to public officials. But whether people are empowered and whether people have the means in order to secure such integrity on the part of public officials, there are many things that have to be done. For example, one of the things that we should be looking out for would be the fate of the Freedom of Information Bill.
Yes.
Because if I'm not mistaken, in the proposal, automatically all SALNs are supposed to be disclosed.
Yes.
All budgets from the local to the national government should be disclosed. Only problem there is that whether people would be attentive to those disclosures or whether it will just be simply media and some other more concerned segments of the public.
But the concern with the Supreme Court was that even when people asked for it, they were unable to get the SALN. Whereas with public officials, it's much easier to actually get access to it.
Well, the concern really is that it's not just a question of one institution.
Yes.
There were requests that were made for the SALNs of all other officials, and those requests have all been turned down. Of course, that would be cured because later on the process of requesting and obtaining it is supposed to be simplified if a Freedom of Information Act is passed. Now, will that Freedom of Information Act be passed in Congress? Would people who would be held accountable eventually relent and say, okay, you can hold us accountable, we'll pass this?
The horse trading. Let me ask you again about the defense argument that everyone is doing it. So it's the pot calling the kettle black in filling out the SALN. Some analysts have said that that is a morally bankrupt argument. I mean, where do those lines? Is this going to help define it for Filipinos, or how do you look at this?
I think the presiding judge, the Senate President, had very clear on trial is the Chief Justice.
Yes.
So it's not a question of whether other people are doing it, is whether the Chief Justice had committed something that would be of an extent that would lead towards a decision whether to reprimand, relieve him, or acquit him. So it's not a question of whether other people have done it. You could not in any way charge these other people. The one who is being accused at this point would be the Chief Justice. And that has been made clear, if I'm not mistaken, in the past few days in the trial.
Let me ask you about the second survey on performance and trust ratings. What were the findings of Pulse Asia there?
We had essentially unchanged ratings for the President in terms of performance, the Vice President, and the House Speaker. There is a change insofar as the approval rating of the Senate President, a significant change in terms of approval. If I can recall, it's about 11 percentage points higher. From about 60 to 71% at present. And there is also a significant change insofar as the disapproval rating of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to the extent that it has become a majority disapproval rating of 58%. I just cannot recall. I think it's about 34% more than what we had last time.
And what did the numbers show you about how Filipinos are looking at their top officials now?
What we've had in the past with regard to the Chief Justice, and I'm not speaking about the current Chief Justice, when people are asked about their rating of the performance of the Chief Justice, the more common response is one of indecision.
Yes.
More people would say
They don't know enough about him.
yeah,
no?
they don't know enough, so therefore they would rather not judge the Chief Justice. This was the case also in November. When we asked whether they will be approving of the Chief Justice, 39% were undecided. However, in the current survey, what we've seen is an increase in terms of disapproval for the Chief Justice and an increase in terms of approval for the Senate President.
Interesting.
You can tie this with some of the other things that we found in the course of in relation to the impeachment.
Yeah.
You have people saying that they think that the Senate has been fair and impartial, and that perception may largely may be connected to the approval rating of the Senate President, who's the presiding judge.
So for those two, we know for sure that it's connected to impeachment. What about the president? How has the president fared in terms of approval rating?
The president's approval and trust rating has not changed. You can say that to most Filipinos, the president has remained quite unrelenting with regard to one part of his campaign promise,
Yes.
and that is to pursue cases of graft and corruption. He has made it quite clear in many of his statements from December of last year when the impeachment process began, when the House impeached the Chief Justice, and he couched the impeachment of the Chief Justice within this crusade that he has.
Yes.
So I would say that in that way, the people feel that he remains committed to one of the things that he promised
Yes.
during the campaign and even as he ascended to the presidency, as he went into the presidency. It has not changed, so therefore there is nothing negative that would bring it to that lead to a decline. This is the first time that we've seen a president holding on to the same level of approval for at least 6 survey observations.
Right.
The last time he was basically tied with the former president,
Yes.
President Arroyo, who maintained her level of approval for 5 consecutive surveys.
A low level of approval rate.
At that time, in 2001, 2002, if I'm not mistaken, the approval ratings of the former President Arroyo was about more than a majority.
Okay.
So she was able to maintain the same level of approval for 5 surveys. And in the case of President Aquino, he has maintained it, essentially unchanged approval and trust ratings.
As a political observer, how would you rate the president's performance?
I would rather just work with other public opinion polls.
Well, let me throw a question to you that's come in from social media from Beth Angshoko from Twitter. Doesn't Pulse Asia think that the survey was premature because only one side has presented evidence?
It would not necessarily be premature because if you follow some of the things that we found out, much of the information came from news. And what you gather from the news are both snippets of what happened during the trial as well as statements coming from the defense and the prosecution. The defense has not necessarily been withholding whatever they would be presenting at the time that they would take their turn in the presentation, which happened after the survey. Within the trial and after the trial and in even their own press conferences, both prosecution and the defense have spoken.
Yes.
And the president, as well as the Chief Justice, have also gotten the same mileage insofar as media. So it is a tentative position, but whether it's premature and whether it is meant to influence, again, this is public opinion. This is something that we aggregate, which people have the right to know. This is part of the right to information. And we respect the opinion both of the public as well as of certain personalities with regard to the survey results.
Well, it's also like taking a picture at a moment in time, right?
Yes.
I mean, you actually said it earlier that it doesn't mean it stays that way. It could change, over time. In the past surveys you've done, there have been changes depending on events.
There have been changes, and at least what's notable in the survey results is that 6 out of 10, as I mentioned, formed their opinion in the course of the trial. The trial has not been completed. The trial is now in the phase where the defense is presenting presenting their witnesses.
Do you think Filipinos are aware of what's at stake in this trial?
I would not, we don't have data, but I think to a great extent, most Filipinos would see it as it's a scandal.
Yeah.
There are protagonists.
Yes.
There's one side and there's another side. The nuances and the internal dynamics is not something, if you just base it on the level of knowledge, where many would claim that they have little or none, they would know who are tussling, but they would not necessarily go to the extent of saying that, oh, there's a question of procedure, there's a question of rule of law, but they know it is a campaign for clean government.
Yes.
They know that this is something that is meant to secure whether the Chief Justice has a right to maintain or be retained in the position. And they are also recognizing the fact that it's the Senate that will make the decision.
Well, let me throw you a question from @Silver Vixen. The disapproval rating of President Aquino is 70%. Are you sure? I remember he's only second to Binay on approval in an article.
The approval rating of President Aquino is 70%. The approval rating of Vice President Binay is 84%. But let me underscore that the approval rating is the approval of their performance for their given responsibilities.
Yes.
So people are being asked to approve of the President, people are being asked to approve of Vice President Binay based on their own understanding
of what
the Vice President is supposed to be doing. So it's like only example I could give is that the President has more subjects, and so therefore would be graded differently from the Vice President, whose area or sphere of responsibility would be definitely smaller, and the expectations of the President will be much more than the expectations of the Vice President. People might not be familiar with what the functions of the Chief Justice are or of the Speaker of the House, but over the period that we conducted the survey, given the trial, the Senate President has definitely been much more present. The coverage of the Senate trial has been much more extensive.
Right.
So therefore, you would expect that people would be able to evaluate his performance, and they've returned an evaluation that is more favorable than what we had in November.
There's also a difference between trust and approval ratings, right? The two tables that you have. Could you explain and what's the difference in the officials? Because they actually switch. There's some differences in the...
The trust rating will be a rating of the individual. This is now not necessarily dependent on their position.
Yep.
So those trust ratings, you may have trust ratings which are high.
Yep.
You might have fluctuations in terms of approval, but you do not necessarily expect significant changes insofar as trust ratings. To a number of Filipinos, I think if I speak for myself, if I trust a person, it's not going to be easy first to confer trust and to withdraw it, right?
Yep.
And that should not be changing. There are specific events, critical incidents that will either help people imbue more trust or withdraw the trust from an individual. And those critical events, we've seen it in the past, when some key personalities suddenly lost both approval and trust. So trust can be a bit more stable than approval. And we asked these two questions separately, whether in Filipino, kung pinagkakatiwalaan nila itong mga individual na ito.
Right.
And that's not necessarily based on the performance of their particular responsibilities.
I'm seeing several Twitter accounts, one from Miss Bugsay, who's asking about the credibility of Pulse Asia. Again, I threw this to you at the beginning, but there seem to be several questions about the relationship of Pulse Asia to President Aquino, and how do you, one Twitter account is asking, how do you deal with the credibility issues?
Well,
is it an issue?
It's, number one, it's not really an issue. This is an issue that has been brought out for quite some time. We've mentioned this before. Our association, the people who associate us with the administration, basically work with the organization's association with relatives of the president, who have not in any way been involved in the operations of Pulse, even if they had invested in Pulse at the start. And it's to us a non-issue, except that, of course, when things are not favorable, we expect that this is par for the course. We frame our own questions, we release the results, regardless of whether it's a commission or, in this case, a non-commission survey. We stake our credibility, not simply as members of Pulse, but we're also academics belonging to different institutions.
And you have a track record also.
So our reputation is not necessarily a reputation that is really just related to the organization, which is Pulse.
I see some questions on the Senate lineup. How did you choose what names get included in the survey?
Yeah, we had 74 names. The people that we included in the survey were people who were either running for re-election, who've been in the institution in the past, and who could probably run. This time around, we had 74. We had 70 names in the November survey. Many of the names were names that were mentioned by political parties. Let's say, for example, if you read the accounts of groups, they would say that they wished to include in the slate this particular individual. Some of the names are known personalities, and even in the past, we've added them to try to find out what their standing would be insofar as, let's say, in an electoral race. We don't know really whether any one of them would be running per se. But
so, for example, Ted Filon, Noli de Castro were also included in
these are celebrities who have had their own elective position experiences. Now, it's a question of whether they would run again.
Right.
We put cabinet members of this administration and even cabinet members in the past administration.
Right.
That is normal. We have placed names of commentators and even celebrities.
Yes.
The number of celebrities that we put in actually would be lower than the number of people who have been involved in politics, either the local or the national level.
What about performance and trust ratings of the Senate and the Supreme Court?
The performance rating, if I'm not mistaken, of the Senate has basically remained unchanged as an institution. And the same thing, I think, for the House of Representatives. I cannot recall the performance rating of the Supreme Court, but if I'm not mistaken,
it's here, the House of Representatives.
It's about less than what they had. It's 11 percentage points down. So this is significantly down in terms of approval.
The House of Representatives.
The Senate.
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court. Okay. The Supreme Court, the approval rating has gone down, but it has shifted largely also to indecision rather than disapproval. So, if you look at it in terms of the consequence of the trial itself, even the institution's own credibility has been more or less tested. If you look at the approval rating of the Supreme Court, where it has gone down from 52% to 41%, although there's not so much a significant increase in terms of disapproval, the decline in approval has shifted to indecision and also a marginal decline in terms of disapproval.
As a political analyst, can I ask you the impact of a decision on the impeachment trial, of an acquittal or of a conviction? What does that mean for the country if we have an acquittal, for example?
If we have an acquittal, it will if you work with a survey where people would accept the decision, the acceptance is something that we can say would be generated from majority of the public. It would depend largely on the explanation of the Senate as a collective, of the impeachment court,
right,
as regards the acquittal.
Right.
Of course, there are two other types of decisions that have been argued in the past. One is that the Supreme Court Chief Justice need not necessarily be relieved and can be only reprimanded.
Senator Santiago actually talked about that, yes.
Senator Santiago and even the constitutionalist Father Bernas would say so. Now, the other thing that we have to look at is that how does it impact on the president's own political capital.
Correct, yeah.
That political capital has somehow been maintained. You've had approval ratings that have remained unchanged. You have trust ratings that remain unchanged.
Right.
the president has sought a conviction, and if that is not given, how would people now perceive the power of the president insofar as really pursuing?
Logically, it would weaken him, would you not? Would you
It
say?
will possibly,
Yeah.
I mean, logically, it may reduce the level of the assessment insofar as the capability of the president to pursue cases of corruption. It will impact on his political capital for that matter. Now, of course, it will. Our next survey will probably be able to test how much that effect would be.
And a conviction, what kind of impact would that have on politics?
The conviction would, first and foremost, really, well, regardless of what the decision is, as long as it's completed, it gives really, it shows the efficacy of the impeachment process. It's a process that
So
was
as a political
abbreviated.
scientist, it's the process itself that's
The
most
process, I
important to you.
mean, if you talk about institution building, the first thing that you should secure is that institutions fully operate.
Yes.
And this is an institutional process of securing accountability. So, and there are all indications point that it will be completed. Unlike, let's say, the first impeachment that was abbreviated and the intervening event was an extra constitutional process of a mass uprising that led to a change in terms of the president. So once completed, at least that secures that, oh, this is the way that impeachment processes go. These are the things that we learn, you know, how you can prepare better an impeachment case, whether the process itself secures that all sides and all evidences are given equal weight, whether it secures the equal protection of law, whether it is not so legalistic.
The process itself. For example, there are other examples of impeachment processes around the world that haven't been as legalistic and have been much faster.
Yes.
I mean, is this process the right process?
Well, what has happened is really, if I will just look back in terms of the two impeachment processes that we've had, there's greater openness on the part of the Senate, learning from the prior impeachment, as much as possible to allow everything to be presented.
Yes.
And that was not even just a response to the plea for liberality on the part of the prosecution. That was made plain and clear by the Senate President, the presiding judge, from the very start. And all throughout, they have maintained that specific position, which I think is good, except that not all of those that have been presented would eventually be weighed by the court in their decision. A number of things were presented for just for the sake of having any of the sides, both the prosecution and the defense, presented. So I guess that's one thing that we may have gained already, and I just hope that they complete the process.
Let me just give you the final words. I mean, in terms of what impeachment, what this survey says about Filipinos at this moment in time.
Well, I would say that people are really interested insofar as the issue. The knowledge may not be as complete, but they basically express an opinion, and they had an option not to express it. And it's an opinion that we should just recognize regardless of whether we agree or disagree with it. And I don't think that it necessarily has to have an influence on an institutional process whose rules are quite well defined. And I just hope that it gets completed.
Okay, Ronnie Holmes, thank you for joining us. That
Thank
is
you, Maria.
Talk Thursday. We've been speaking with Ronnie Holmes, the president of Pulse Asia. Visit Rappler.com and tell us how you feel on our mood meter. I'm Maria Ressa. As we say at Rappler, tomorrow begins today. Parang at this point in time, you can't...